As Cardinal George Pell faces jail time for sexually abusing two choirboys, the church he made financially secure is demoralized and losing members. Sydney, Australia. Despite a series of sexual abuse scandals stretching back decades, Australia's Roman Catholic Church displays a veneer of strength. Across Australia, more Catholic parishes have stayed open than in other countries that have weathered abuse scandals, and Catholic schools are still filled with children, owing largely to the financial and legal savvy of Australia's most prominent cleric, Cardinal George Pell. But it's not the bank accounts that are empty in the Australian church, it's the pews. In December, Cardinal Pell was convicted of sexually abusing two choirboys in the 1990s, making him the highest-ranking Catholic clergyman in the world to be found guilty of such a crime. The shocking charges and subsequent conviction have hardened distrust and anger among Catholics in Australia, pushing the country's once robust church further into a precipitous, and perhaps record-setting, decline. "It's been disastrous," said Dr. Peter Wilkinson, a former Catholic priest and researcher in Melbourne, where Cardinal Pell served as the Archbishop. "I'd say we've lost about 2, possibly 3 generations of young people, and now I think the situation is worsening. The older generation is following the young." Even compared with other countries facing long-running abuse scandals, Australia's decline in church attendance is remarkable. In the 1950s, 74% of Catholics in Australia attended Mass weekly. In 2011, only 12% of the country's 5.3 million Catholics went to Mass periodically, not even weekly, and that is expected to fall again when new data is published this year. The exodus in Australia is a far more dramatic defection than in the United States, where 39% of Catholics say they attend church at least once a week, according to a Gallup poll last year, or Ireland, where weekly attendance has fallen to 44%. And it is happening in a country where Catholic schools are still an institutional force. They educate roughly 1 in 5 Australian children and receive nearly 80% of their financing from the government, the legacy of a crisis in the 1960s, when the Labour Party agreed to rescue Catholic schools from debt and deterioration. The result is an unusual dichotomy. Australia's Catholic Church is financially stronger than its counterparts in many countries. It is also more spiritually abandoned. And Cardinal Pell, 77, a domineering figure who was until recently the Vatican's chief financial officer, shaped both trends in ways that many Australians are now questioning. Sign up for the Australia letter. As Archbishop of Melbourne in October 1996, 2 months, it turns out, before the incidents that led to his recent conviction, Cardinal Pell set up what would become a firewall for the church's finances and reputation. He called it the Melbourne Response. On paper, it was an alternative resolution process for abuse survivors. Cardinal Pell said it aimed to make it easier for victims to achieve justice outside the courts. But it capped payments, initially at $50,000 Australian dollars, or $35,000, and usually forced victims to keep their traumas confidential. Cardinal Pell brought a similar approach to Sydney, where he served as Archbishop from 2001 to 2014. He fought hard to discourage victims from going to court, even as he could often be heard condemning homosexuality and raising money for conservative causes and politicians, like the former Prime Ministers Tony Abbott and John Howard. Both men expressed support for Cardinal Pell after news of his conviction became public. Most notably, he led an aggressive defense against a former altar boy, John Ellis, who said he had been raped and abused as a child by a priest in Sydney, the Rev. Aidan Duggan. Father Duggan died in 2004 before the allegations from Mr. Ellis and several others surfaced. Mr. Ellis argued that the church's main resolution process had failed him but that when he sued and then tried to settle, Cardinal Pell refused. In 2007, Mr. Ellis lost. An appeals court ruled that the Catholic Church in Australia could not be sued because it did not exist as a formal legal entity. They'd already agreed that Ellis had been abused over a long period by a priest, said Dr. Wilkinson, president of Catholics for Renewal, a lay reform group. Pell used that case to make sure that anybody who thought of challenging a payout in the civil courts would go through hell. His combative approach, a covert war on victims, as Mr. Ellis described it in a recent editorial, did its job, at least financially. The Ellis defense was invoked repeatedly to deter civil suits. Internal church documents from 2015 showed that the Melbourne response saved the church as much as 62 million Australian dollars, or $44 million. A royal commission has unearthed horrific patterns of abuse. 4,444 people brought incidents of child sexual abuse to 93 Catholic Church authorities from January 1980 to February 2015. And yet, in large part because of Cardinal Pell, Australia's Catholic Church has experienced a much smaller percentage of church and school closings than the United States, despite a plunge in mass attendance. At a recent morning mass at St. Patrick's Catholic Church in Sydney's eastern suburbs, there were just a dozen parishioners, mostly older women.